Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Digital Signage Today webinar, Why Software as a Service Matters for Digital Signage and How to Make Sure You're Getting the Real Thing, sponsored by Spinetics. I'm Kevin Amask, editor of Digital Signage Today. Today's webinar features George Preston, VP of Sales North America for Spinetics. George leads sales strategy for the company's North American region. He has more than 15 years of experience in the AV, digital signage, and networking fields. Today, George will discuss how to use digital signage to strengthen client relationships by promoting a software as a service approach while reducing risk, sidestepping unexpected costs, and keeping customers delighted. Now, there will be a live Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, so make sure to post your questions in the chat box below. And now with that, let's turn it over to George.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, thank you so much for your interest in this subject, everyone. I really hope that by the end of today's session, it will have inspired some thought about the choice that either you or your customer might be about to make with a digital signage investment. Spinetics launched our software as a service product, Aria Enterprise, 3 years ago, and we've been learning ever since. But one thing that we never predicted was how many of our customers would say that they realize that they've never actually used a real software as a service product in signage before. Their old products looked like SaaS, and they were built like SaaS, certainly, but that's where it ended. So we set to finding out a bit more about this, about how real software as a service is defined and, of course, why it matters. And that's what I want to start with today, starting with an analogy. Imagine you're a business and you're just starting out. You need somewhere for your employees to work. And in the old days, you might have bought an office, or certainly have rented an office, but taken responsibility for that building. That means that as well as concentrating on your core business, you're also having to think about the maintenance of the building, keeping it up to date so that your employees are happy, maintaining it so that it's safe, and doing all sorts of things which aren't just time taken away from your business, but are a focus that isn't your core business. And that's switching focus from what you do to what you have to do is inefficient. Software as a service is like the shared office space. It's like the multi-tenant serviced office, to that example. You have a dedicated space. Let me just turn on my pointer here. You've got a dedicated space, but all the things that you don't want to have to worry about, services, power, water, maintenance of the building, are taken care of by someone else. What's more is you can expand if you need more space. You can even contract. You don't have to use all the services that the building offers. Maybe they provide coffee for some tenants and not for others. But the point is those services are optional and modular, and you can make a choice without having to take on more responsibility. It's not just that the company maintains things to a minimum standard, but the shared office provider cares about having more tenants. You are their customer, so they want to make sure that the building is the most up-to-date, the most inviting, and the most comfortable, and the most secure. We'll talk about security in a few slides' time, but the most important thing here is this multi-tenanted approach, both in the analogy of the shared office and in software as a service itself, is the absolute core tenet. Software as a service takes one application, one program, and then very securely breaks out spaces for different customers to have, with a wall around them, just like you have in your shared office space. I'll be coming back to references about this shared office, serviced office space as we go through the presentation. Now, a few more things, a bit of text here about some actual core tenets to software as a service. And you'll find these are quite common to all types of SaaS, not just digital signage, but pretty much any enterprise resource planning software that you'll find. And the first one is about upgrades. Nothing stays still these days. Any piece of software that you use is going to be expected to stay up to date, both in terms of features and in terms of security. The difference with software as a service is that the software is live. You're always using a live version, and those changes are iterative over time. So it means instead of having a very bursty set of changes, which happen maybe every year or every 2 years, according to when budgets allow or when someone needs it, those things happen iteratively and gradually. And the implementation of those changes is managed by the vendor. Those changes are managed by the vendor. This is another thing that's important. Real SaaS will talk about configuration, not about customization. And why is that? Because just like in your serviced office space, certain facilities are available to you. The fact that the building owner has modularized the services that they offer optionally to clients means that they can be the most efficient about providing them. If they have to give you a completely bespoke setup for your office, then that's not efficient, and they'll ultimately pass those costs on to you. So software as a service is configured. We're not customizing things so that they run and are developed independently of other customers. This is a similar point here. All customers should be really using the same code, the same program. You'll see online when the early uses of software as a service, what people found years later was that they had actually been effectively rented their previous on-premise product back to them. And that doesn't work because in the office example, it's a serviced office company, but really they're just giving you a building each, which doesn't save any money and doesn't really save any overhead. Everything just costs. Software as a service, and if you think about big common tools that you might use, things like Airtable, Zapier, Dropbox, these services, everyone's using the same instance of code, the same program. And then remember, in the serviced office example, we talked about scalability, growth as your company expands, as your needs expand. We know from 15 years of experience at Spinetics that customers sometimes upgrade at a very, very slow lick at first, but then they'll say, actually, we're going to standardize this into the next continent. And 20 or 50 screens goes to 500. If you're talking to a vendor and you ask them about scalability, and when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of screens, they say, actually, that might need some really, really big changes. That's a red flag, because software as a service is using the infrastructure that powers the largest services in the world. And thousands or even tens of thousands of endpoints are a drop in the bucket for the load on that infrastructure. They shouldn't sweat it at all if you want to talk about scalability worldwide. And here's another thing that we'll get to in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. If you want to start using software as a service, if you're an end user and you think, actually, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, poke around the system and see what it's like, then you should be able to do that immediately. I put a few days here on this slide because perhaps there's an approval process and an account manager wants to call you and check things are okay. But really, this is something that should be done in minutes or hours, not days. If when you're talking to a company and you want to see what the software is like and get involved, if they tell you that's something that's going to require someone sending you a server or an account manager spinning up a new instance or anything that sounds like something's being done specially for you, that's a red flag because it's probably not true SaaS. Integration is something that matters in digital signage more than ever. If, like me, when you travel around, you notice digital signage screens in hotels, in airports, in any facilities that you go to, especially state and government-run facilities, you'll notice that they sometimes have error messages and problems. And those problems weren't there at the beginning. They're there because a dependent service changed and the signage system didn't. It's no good keeping your system up to date if its dependencies aren't keeping up to date on the same tempo. And this is about responsibility. Who's responsible for making sure those integrations are there? With true SaaS, it's the vendor who does that. And why? It's because they've configured your system with integrations that they know and understand and continue to maintain. Every upgrade checks that those things continue to work. And then the last thing on this slide, and I know there are some people in the audience who are going to be responsible for budgets and spending, you'll know what cost of ownership means. Upfront costs, recurring costs, you can predict these things and you can amortize your costs. But you can't do that if you don't know what you're going to be faced with in the future and you don't know when it's going to happen. Software as a service should give you a clear, predictable monthly or annual cost. Of course, any end user license agreement with any software application is going to say things may change over time, but challenge your vendor and say, what happens after 2 or 3 years? Do you double the cost? Do most customers renew, or do they say that we don't want to pay anymore? This is about consistency. The vendor's entire business, just like the serviced office provider's business, is based around being able to people staying because they can predict what that cost is going to be the next year and the next year and the next year. And there's one last thing here, which is about security. Security is really important. Security has a particular speech in software as a service that we'll get to towards the end. But one of the things that the serviced office provider does is make sure that the building's secure. They make sure the keypads are secure, the locks are secure, the burglar alarm, the fire alarm. They can do that in one way because they're taking care of one set of people, their customers. And it's just the same as software as a service. A software as a service vendor who's doing true SaaS will be able to show you the processes and the policies globally with all of their tenants that encompass the physical network, application, and data level security. These are specific layers that certain penetration tests and security standards will address, and they should address all of them. Going back to the analogy, it's much, much harder to keep the security of one building, which is shaped a different way and in a different place with different regulations, much, much more complicated than doing it with software as a service in a multi-tenanted building. And then also, finally, but by no means least, this backup and disaster recovery. Software as a service is always delivered through the cloud. And the cloud means we're using the internet and scalable infrastructure to deliver. But it's not just scalability we get from true software as a service. It means that if something were to happen in one location, something which took out an entire city or even an entire country or a power grid, software as a service, because it obfuscates, it detaches you from the layer of the building or the servers, we can invisibly move that application to another place which is owned by the cloud provider. And at any one time in the world, disasters are happening, small disasters, big disasters, things are going wrong, which would otherwise affect people's infrastructure. But only with software as a service do you have a level of guarantee that your service will continue to deliver and you don't need to worry about geographical problems. Many of the things on that slide apply to lots of software as a service, and it's probably quite theoretical, but I really want to look here at some things which are specific to signage. This is what Spinetics has experienced in the 3 years since we launched Aria Enterprise. One of the first ones is, in the beginning of the design and deployment of a system, nobody thinks how much things are going to change. And it's true. I mean, look at the things that may be in your home or in your office, like a television, like another electronics device, and think where it was 5 years ago. With signage, things need to stay live. But 5 years ago, we had lower resolution screens. We had less vibrant colors in images and videos. We even had different standards of cables. So we need a digital signage system to account for all of these standards and formats. And it's not enough to ask when you need them or to reactively change them. If you're using a signage system and you're pushing some content that comes from your design and branding agency, for example, or even your internal marketing team, they're going to be keeping their software up to date. And I might send you an image or a video in a different format. The signage system should accept that at the same tempo as that interdependent system. Many people add new screens. In fact, in the AV market we're in, it's practically impossible to get a screen a few months later, which is exactly the same as the one earlier. Now, most of those changes are quite small, but at one point, the new screen will have a new resolution, a new refresh rate, or something else that's technical. You want to be able to leverage the most from that display. Displays now, screens look better than they did 10 years ago. It's no good if you invest in new ones and everything looks the same. So your software as a signage service needs, digital signage needs to be aware of these improvements. Down here, integration with new enterprise services. There is hardly a signage system that exists in the corporate communication sphere that doesn't have a dependency on at least one other tool that's used within the company. Those tools are changing at breakneck speeds. Relationships with those companies matter. It's no good just upgrading and hoping they catch up, or letting them upgrade and thinking, well, we'll catch up when people complain. Going back to that modular idea about software as a service, the modules connect to these services, and a good SaaS provider will have relationships with all of the providers of the connections so that they keep the cadence of their updates at the same speed. And the same goes for things which might sound trivial, like weather and stock feeds and news, but actually these are part of any signage system. Even some of our offline systems which are doing things in defense will use weather and environmental information. Security standards is another one. If you're someone who's in the IT world and you keep up with IT news, you'll know that often when there's a major outage of a system that's even made the mainstream news, it's because a certificate has expired, or an encryption length or key length has become outdated and has to be brought up to speed again. Security updates matter, because if security updates aren't there, it's not only that things are insecure, it's that we get denial of service. We get the system not working properly. And then this one here, we really experienced a lot during COVID. It's no good just keeping something up to date because that's what everyone else is doing. Your SaaS vendor should think, what are people going to be using our software for because of what's happening now? So for example, we were able to react during COVID with real-time changing QR codes and the ability to line up QR codes on a monitor. We had many customers telling us, we've got screens around the building and in reception, and when people go in, there's no receptionist, there's no one to guide them. How can we do this? And we were able to spin up a QR code app using different types of QR codes with 6 or 8 on the screen at the same time, sometimes within a few minutes, and then we pushed a release. Another thing was Live Agent. We were able to change screens remotely or change customers' accounts so they had access to a live feedback, real-time video and audio conversation with someone remote. Specific things that if you're dealing with several different installations, i.e. non-SaaS, to install and upgrade every single customer's code, every customer's application, it's just far too expensive. These real-time updates lend themselves to SaaS really well. And then one last thing here, which I think is really valuable, is getting real-time customer feedback from right within the product. Now, those on the call will probably what we would call end users, our end customers who are considering investing. But actually, once you go ahead and buy your system and start running it, there's a new customer. That's your operator within the company. Could be often hundreds or even thousands of people within one firm. They're incredibly useful as an audience, because those people, once they start to use something regularly, that's how we can work out whether it should change iteratively or whether it should stay the same. This is about changing user experience, changing customer experience based on how they feed back in the product. And I'll mention this in a couple of slides' time. Sometimes it's passive, but another great thing about software as a service is that we can actually ask people questions as they're using the product. In Spinetics Area Enterprise, we have a chat box which lets people talk to people in real time. Chat saying, I've forgotten how to do this. I'm trying to do something new. I'm not sure. And they can get help then and there. And they can get that because they're using the cloud. I want to move now to talking about something more related to measurement. So we've talked about what the features are that you should look for when you're talking to a vendor. But they might say, yes, we've got all these things. How do you ask them whether they're actually working and whether what they're experiencing and whether what their customers are experiencing is reflective of a true SaaS model? The first one is the renewal rate. We were very surprised when we launched our SaaS product at how many customers came off their 3, 4, or 5-year minimum contract term with their previous product, which in software as a service is a very long time, particularly in non-enterprise products, and then said, we're going to look for other products. We're done with this. We now look for other products. Well, an annual service contract with software as a service should mean people that organically renew. You're not forcing people to renew, you're not hoping that they renew and going after chasing them with a contract and a lawyer. They should renew because they want to. Most Spinetics customers, for example, in the last 15 years, use our product for more than 8 years, and they continue using the product because it continues to delight them. So challenge the vendor you're talking to on what is your natural annual or monthly renewal rate. If their answer suggests that the way they work is they simply sell 3-year contracts and then move on and then don't really talk to the customer again, not only is that not very good customer service, but it's probably not true software as a service, because true software as a service recoups the investment into the product, the investment into improving the building, because people want to stay. The second one here is about new features. It's no good just having a team in an ivory tower who work on the product, say, this would be cool, this would be great, let's do this. But the people using the product don't adopt those features. Remember, with software as a service, the customer is independent as much as possible. When she's using the product, she doesn't want to be told, you must start using this, or I need to take time out of your working day to train you on how to use this. No, software as a service will delight the customer. And that means giving them small changes that they didn't even know they wanted. Everyone on the call, I expect, will be a smartphone user. You'll be using one of the 2 popular operating systems that are on all smartphones. And you'll know what it's like to one day see that something's changed. And there's a difference when a change is implemented well, because you think, that's really cool, and it fits in with the way I'm working, I'm going to start embracing that. Versus an app that has a change which is bad. And you go into it and you think, it doesn't look the same, I don't understand it, why is it changed? It was fine before. If things are changing iteratively, we're learning about customer interactions, then new features should be adopted automatically by customers. And then the last one is system expansion. It relates a bit to renewal rate. Talk to your vendor about how do people expand the system that they have. We talked about scalability, but if the mindset of the customer is, well, I justify this big investment and this long commitment for 3 or more years, and once I've done that, we're just going to use it as it is. There really should be an example of customers saying the value that this gives our organization means we want to expand it to new users, new buildings, new countries, and new people. It won't happen with every business, of course, but more than half of our end users at Spinetics, after the first year, upgrade, expand their system in one way.
So George, the renewal rate and expansion are relatively simple to measure, but how do you track the adoptions of new features?
That's a good question. Sure. Adoption of new features is measured through something called telemetry. And when I was on the slide earlier and we were talking about customer feedback, something that's possible in software as a service is the collection of telemetry data. Telemetry is very exciting if you work on product design, because it's real-time feeding, logging of real customer activity, how the mouse moves, how quickly someone spends on something, how much time someone spends on something, how quickly they do it, how they flow through the product, do they get into the flow state? And you get this by crunching through reams and reams of data of how people move around. That's called telemetry. It's not new to SaaS. Telemetry is something that's been present in user interface for a really long time, but you can only aggregate the data with SaaS. That's why it's so interesting. If you tell a customer with their own instance of a piece of software, we're going to be logging all of your activity, that's an immediate no for obvious reasons. But if you don't care about the individual user, you've got thousands or tens of thousands of users, the data is completely anonymized because you're not connecting their activity to the particular system because it's in the cloud. You have this very rich data that helps inform your product design team on, say, should we move this button to the left? Should we change this so that it happens faster or slower depending on people's feedback?
Yeah, sounds good, George.
Okay, so we've talked about how good SaaS is measured by renewals, by new features being adopted, by organic system expansion. Let's talk about something that really here is unique to digital signage. In our industry, in any IT industry, the word solution gets thrown around a lot. And I know from having worked in this sector for a long time now that I almost get quite sick of hearing it. What does it mean that we're a solution? What does it really mean, the word solution? Well, in digital signage, solution means that the whole stack, right from the cloud right down to how the players communicate with your own network, right through to the player, and even right through to the screen itself. There's one point of responsibility. And that's really important in signage and not so much in other things for a reason called interactivity. Now, interactivity is not what you're thinking with touchscreens and so on. It's that if you think about a phone or a laptop or even a printer in an office, there is a split relationship, a split responsibility between a central team who looks after that product to make sure it works and the person using the device. You can't just control your employees' smartphones and computers and reboot them and change them and update them whenever you want because they're in the middle of using them. Even a printer has a split responsibility because replacing the paper is done by people locally, but making sure the printer is running the latest software and can connect to the latest cloud sources is done centrally. And that's because there's always an interactive user element. But thinking of the example I gave before of when you might go around and see signage screens that don't work properly, that doesn't work with signage. And that's why broken signage has error messages on the screen, expecting someone to click on them or even look at them. And that's because signage appliances are headless. They don't have a user who's there administering them. They're really an extension of the cloud coming down into the customer's premises. And no interactive user, well, you think, well, maybe just in the offline times or out of business hours, someone could plug in and use it. But actually, many signage applications are 24-hour. Many Spinetics customers are running production sites or shipping or logistics or other type of manufacturing where there's a 3-shift day. And the people who start at 1 o'clock in the morning consider the signs to be as important, as they should do, as the people who start at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. They need to rely on them. And they will expect those screens to be running 24 hours a day for 10 years. It's not enough to say that the responsibility for those players lies with the local IT and they can have the occasional unscheduled reboot. They don't even sit on the same trusted network as the local area network. They sit with connection to the internet through a DMZ, and so they need to be completely managed over the internet securely. So again, challenge your cloud software as a service vendor on who is responsible for the patching and the updates of the devices. That's absolutely key if you want to avoid a signage system which looks like, unfortunately, far too many that you see in public. And if their response is, well, it's bring your own device, or you can install it on a PC, or you have a selection of devices to buy, but none of them come from us, that's going to be a bad sign. And it might work well in the beginning, but over time, that split responsibility is not going to work if that device is expecting someone nearby to press a button or OK or submit in a message. On the call, looking at the audience here, there are value-added resellers, a couple of managed service providers, and there are end-user customers. There's a relationship there that matters. And SaaS makes those relationships better. That's what my team and I are doing here in the US. We're empowering our integrators and resellers to add software as a service to their portfolio confidently. And one of the ways you do that is you're open with both parties about how this makes life easier for everyone. If you're selling software that's on-site, on-premise, or hosted, but not true SaaS, and you're a local partner responsible for this, this is what your delivery overhead looks like over time. So we've got time, and here we've got effort. Each customer is going to upgrade on their own schedule, either because you proactively upgrade or because they're forced to, because something hasn't been kept up to date. Some customers are going to update more regularly. Some are just going to do spiky, bursty upgrades with no planning at all. Some customers will update once and never again, which is a hassle if you're trying to plan revenue and plan how you can support that customer. Other customers won't know how often they need to update and they'll do it too frequently. The point is it's a mess. And as a service business, you're having to employ people and engage resources to help customers, but you don't have visibility on how it works. In the true SaaS model, it's not that the product stays the same. The product improves over time. But the effort of maintaining the customers, the stability of the customer's installation and their level of happiness with it is the same for everyone. The vendor will say to you, we are going to do a major update in 2 weeks. We're fixing some things, we're improving the look and feel of the interface. You might get some support calls as a value-added reseller. You might proactively approach customers about that, but you know it's happening, and you know it's happening for everyone at the same time.
So, George, does that one line mean everyone must be using exactly the same version of the product? So I'm talking about that the pink line there in the second chart.
Yes, I think I want to be clear here. This line, and indeed these lines, are not a reflection of how the product changes. They're a reflection of how much overhead there is in managing and anticipating those changes. Also, there will be customers using the product differently. Going back to the modular argument, SaaS doesn't mean homogenization. It doesn't mean compromise. But because over time everyone knows what the modules are, you can automate how the proactive messages about how to use the product. Just like going back to our shared office example, if there's going to be a problem with a coffee machine because it's being replaced, the message that goes to the tenants who are using it is a different message that goes to the tenants who aren't using that. But that can all be part of your automation and your customer experience management.
All right, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we're coming to the end. I think we're on time. I just have a couple more slides. And this one is really about getting started. I hope that going through this material has made you think, I would like to dive into this, or I'd like to see what it's like. Well, thinking about Signage specifically, remember going back to an earlier slide, I talked about how really a provider should let you roll up your sleeves and get stuck in and poke around quickly. You should be able to get a demo account. Just like a serviced office company will welcome you in to have a tour of the office with open arms. If you want to go further and see what it's going to look like on your screens, you should be able to install players in a very simple way. The way that we do it at Spinetics, for example, is you just put the screen on, a 4-digit code appears, you put the 4-digit code into our SaaS product, and they're linked together. If you need to rely on a lot of expertise in order to make this jump from testing a demo account to having players, then, well, again, the customer experience isn't perfect, but it also suggests that the people installing the players aren't really connected and trained properly by the people who are offering the SaaS product. Once you've got players installed, because remember from the last slide, players are specific to digital signage, you need those to be managed by the vendor. You then add content, you explore the system, perhaps you have questions, you see how it would work at scale, you share it with other colleagues and they can all be part of your demo account as well with no penalties or restrictions. And then when you're happy, you don't then need to start again from scratch. You can migrate to a production account immediately. Because in a database, it's simply flip of the switch. Just like in your shared office, you want to get in, try out the seats, try out the facilities. If you want to get going, that's going to be the space that you rent, not somewhere else down the street that you haven't seen. Something we also do at Spinetics, which was a reaction to the natural growth of our customers' accounts, is that you can add players to your account at any time. And I'm saying that, I think it sounds so obvious. Why wouldn't you make it easy to add players to an account at any one time? But it's not just the adding of players, it's the prorated billing as well. If you've got a provider that says, well, you can only add players now after 6 months, and by the way, if it's more than 6 months, we're going to charge you for a year, or we're going to have you set up in 3 different billing cycles, that is not something you want to have to deal with, trust me. So once you've got going, and you should be able to get going with as few as 1 devices, no penalties, where as soon as you want to add 1 more, 5 more, 10 more, 20, 50 more, that should be something that is a very, very simple process. I just want to touch on scalability, because remember that grid of text we looked at in slide 2, it's the only thing which I haven't expanded on. So just quickly, the system should be able to scale. I know that sounds so obvious, it doesn't even need to be said, but we have many customers that said, we started with 20 players, we ended with 20 players. Because just trying to get hold of someone who, when we said, look, we're opening a new building, we want 5 more screens, that person had to go back into their account, remember who they are, find out what version they're running, talk to their service technician about it. The cost involved just wasn't there. Scalability in SaaS should be something that is completely taken for granted. So we've talked about increasing the installation size from 200 to 2,000 players, but with no infrastructure changes at all. That's really important. and it shouldn't matter where they are. A good software as a service system won't just make the network global. It will localize the network. If you've got content on a device that has the weather or the temperature or the date, when you open an office in South Korea, where the date is 4-digit year, dot 2-digit month, dot 2-digit day, completely the opposite to Europe and different still to the US, you shouldn't have to worry about that. The cloud application should take care of that localization for you. And then lastly, there's not such an obvious thing, is you should be able to scale the number of users. Don't go for a system which penalizes you based on having more users, because that's a catch. A good system, more people will want to use it. And there's a tool that we have, because of software as a service, that's very, very hard to implement if you're using an on-premise tool. And this is called single sign-on. Single sign-on is the thing that you use every day and you don't even realize. It's so that when you log onto your PC, all of the cloud services and even the non-cloud services in some cases that you're using don't require you to sign on again and again and again, and they don't require you to keep different lists of usernames and passwords. ARIA Enterprise, as an example, supports single sign-on as a one-time service that the customer could take advantage of, and it means that people just use the software like they do other tools on their machine. This is my penultimate slide, and I want to just touch on what really is one of the most important things. Because one of the inquiries, one of the questions we still get about software as a service, I feel like it shouldn't come up as much as it does, but it does because there's a misunderstanding about cloud. Those on the call who are either in government, in a government department, or regularly selling to and supporting and consulting for government departments will start to be familiar, if not already, with something called zero trust. What's zero trust? It's a security methodology, a security paradigm that says no one is trusted. No phone, no PC, no laptop. It doesn't matter where you are. Everyone's going to have to authenticate as if we don't know them when they connect. And that's a departure from what was called perimeter security before. Before, if you're on the corporate network, you can access the printer, no problem, because we know you're on the corporate network. You can access this server, it doesn't matter, you're on the corporate network, you're away from the internet. The trouble is with this system is, as soon as someone infects one of these devices within your network, they can then get to all of these devices, which might be servers, which might be data stores holding confidential information. In fact, this is the biggest vector at the moment for huge hacking attacks that you see in the news, is that people have used phishing attempts to, quote unquote, get into a network and then move laterally within it because the devices within the network are trusted. Software as a service employs zero trust. You don't have to have Spinetics devices on your local network. They don't need to talk to any of your local services or servers. That's all done through the cloud. Any penetration tests that a security internal or external team throws at us and any provider you talk to, you should be able to pass. In fact, you can even put digital signage players, you should be able to, on a completely public network, even on the guest network, and they should function fully because they're geared up for a zero trust network. Now, I have, in my haste, covered up this QR code here with my red pen. I'll just see if I can quickly fix that, because if anyone wants to get and learn more about this, you can put your phone at this slide right now, or you can just remember spinetics.com/security and read our good practices to security in this domain. We are a provider of many projects into government installations, both US and other countries as well. And of course, the requirements and the demands for security on those are the highest they could possibly be. That's the end of my presentation. I just want to leave you with this slide because in 2 weeks' time, we'll be at Infocom in Las Vegas. We hope to see you there. We'll be at booth N535, right in the middle of the digital signage area. The whole team will be there. I'll be there, my team, our team from our headquarters in Switzerland. We'd be delighted to talk to you either about software as a service or about anything you're thinking about considering with regard to digital signage. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, George, for a great presentation. I think we all definitely learned a great deal about SaaS and digital signage, so I appreciate that. I appreciate your time and your expertise. I do have a few questions on my end, if you don't mind.
No.
Yeah, so now these are two terms that I see a great deal in covering the industry, but kind of want to get your take on it. What is the relationship between the terms cloud and software as a service, and are they interchangeable?
That's a good question. Yeah, not least because whoever asked that probably saw me using those or heard me using those interchangeably a little bit through the presentation. Cloud means the internet for what we're talking about here. Cloud is a product which is delivered over the internet. If it's a cloud product, you need the internet in order for it to work. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the browser. Think of Microsoft Office 365, for example, but most of the time, these are browser-based applications. It's a technical architecture network term. So cloud is the opposite of on-premise. Software as a service is a commercial agreement. So software as a service is about how you engage with your vendor, what the level of support is, and then some of those key tenets I talked about in the earlier slides: single application, single security, services taken care of in a multi-tenanted way. So the two are used in concert with each other a lot, but software as a service is more about how you deliver something commercially. Cloud is more about how you deliver it technically.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, very good. Thank you. And the next one I have is kind of interesting. Is there a customer profile that will never move to software as a service?
Is there a customer profile who will never move to SaaS? I don't think so, but had you asked us the question only a year or two ago, the obvious answer would have been high availability environments, including defense. But actually, what's happened since then, a lot, and lots of government customers have told us, and we're working with them already, is a move to zero trust. So the answer that we will always be on premise, or there'll be sectors which are always on premise, zero trust takes away the concept of on premise. There is no premises, everything's on the internet. So what you find is that certain commercial entities and government departments move to the cloud, but they demand a move to a private cloud. So private cloud is this thing which exists inside, outside your network. It crosses the boundary, but it's more secure. It's still multi-tenanted, but it's private cloud because there's another perimeter around it. Perhaps you need a VPN to get into the cloud, and then you use the services, or you need a key card or something else. That's still software as a service, and it still has all the benefits of software as a service in terms of relationships and how up-to-date things and customer experience and so on. So no, I don't think actually there's any. I mean, I look at news just last week, I think, of the growth in software as a service and cloud in the tens of billions. I really don't think there's a single vertical which is being left behind. No.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. And now this next one has to kind of do with getting back to security. You've explained that software as a service is secure in terms of network security, but what about data protection and regulations?
Yes, true. We didn't touch on data protection, but actually that is answered by the software as a service model. So if you think about how previously with fake SaaS, which is just a server or a collection of servers hosted somewhere, which is rented back to you as the customer, where that is matters. Just like where the physical office is, going back to the analogy again. If you want to move offices, you want to move the building. But in SaaS, because we're obfuscating from the hardware, from the physical infrastructure, we're putting a layer between that. There's a phrase called spin up, which means to kind of basically bring to life a version of the application you were using in a physically different place. Nothing changes at all because the application is the same, and the replication to make sure that the application in one physical space in California, for example, is the same as the one in Germany, is the same as the one in Australia. But you satisfy the requirements for data protection. And in fact, we experience that a lot at Spinetics. We're using AWS for our infrastructure. And of course, within AWS, you can say, I need to spin up an instance here. And it's done within an hour. But you can only do it with software as a service. If you want to If you need to worry about data protection and you're not using software as a service, it's a completely different conversation.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that answer. It definitely seems that software as a service has a lot of versatility, and it seems like only good things are on the horizon. So it's exciting to see that. And yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of today's webinar, George. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And yeah, and everyone that attended today, make sure to check your email inbox for the on-demand version of today's webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us today on the Digital Signage Today webinar.